It is my great pleasure to introduce Eva Horn today. Eva is a professor of modern German literature and cultural theory at the University of Vienna. She has taught in Germany, Switzerland, the US, France, and Austria. Eva has an incredibly versatile corpus of work, writing about political theory, media theory, disaster imagination in the modern age, historical conceptions of climate, and also the Anthropocene. Her book about political secrecy in the 20th century, called The Secret War, Treason, Espionage, and Modern Fiction, appeared in 2013 with Northwestern University Press. The Future as Catastrophe, Imagining Disaster in the Modern Age, was published in 2018 with Columbia University Press. Together with Hannes Bergthaler, she wrote The Anthropocene, Key Issues for the Humanities with Routledge. She also has published a not yet translated monograph on melancholy, mourning, and representations of death from the Baroque through the long 18th century. Eva has co-edited a number of volumes on figures of thought, Denkfiguren, and on the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and on the swarm as a phenomenon of decentralized collective agency. For today, the most relevant of her many, many articles might be the one called Air Conditioning, which is about, the subtitle translates The Taming of Climate as a Project of Modernity. So the Department of German has been very fortunate to have Eva Horn here as our Max Kade Distinguished Visiting Professor, and we thank the Max Kade Foundation for its support, along with the Townsend Center for supporting this event. Eva's multiple presentations in our department and around campus have sparked incredibly lively and energetic discussions. We've had conferences, guest appearances, and seminars, and I expect today will be no different. So please join me in welcoming Professor Eva Horn.
Okay, yes. First of all, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Karen, for inviting me and steering me through the adventures of Berkeley administration and, and technology use and all sorts of things. Yeah, it's a great honor to be here, and it's also a great pleasure to catch what for me are the last days of summer in this very hot and dry climate. I love it. I will be talking about climate and weather and a sense of air. I will essentially try to sum up of some of the core arguments of the book on climate that Karen just mentioned. My point of departure in the book, and maybe not really my biographical point of departure, but in the book, is this. It's an installation by James Turrell. It's a room. You go and inside a building, you open a door, you're in a room, and there's this bright light installation at the ceiling. I was there in March. It's in New York and in somewhere in Brooklyn, Williamsburg, at the PS1, and it was a bit cold, but there was this fantastic bright light installation, LED, I suppose. So I sat down on this bench and stared at the LED installation that was so realistic until it dawned on me that is the sky. It's a way of, it's not artificial, it's a bird flew through and it's like, okay, and that's why it's so cold in here. I'm outside the building, not inside the building. So what this installation does is that it kind of frames the sky, the air, the weather in a way that it takes you a while, but then you start noticing it as such. You sit down and you stare at the sky as if it was a work of art, very, with an attention to detail, with an attention to the sensual effects that this has on you, the cold, the smells, the noises, that Brooklyn smell. I don't know, a little bit of asphalt, a little bit of fat, you know, like French fry fat. And you know that go out after my talk and try to notice what is the specificity of this Berkeley air. Sometimes when you exit a plane, and you're not going through one of those fingers, you just step outside, you have that feeling. For a split second, you notice the air. The smell, the color, so to speak, of it. This is what I will be talking about, but not with Brooklyn 2017, I think it was, but with different material that had a very direct relationship to what we call the air or climate. This is the book. So my point, advertising point for this talk would be you suffer for maybe 50, maybe 60 minutes, but then you don't have to buy the book. It's coming out in a few weeks. If you're interested, buy it or write me. Yeah. Since this talk is framed in a lecture series that is called Rethinking the Future, and since I have been working on the future, but not in this context so much, I was thinking, relation between future and climate change. Of course, even when I was working on this book for quite a while, and so I was presenting my stuff or at parties, like, what are you working on? I'm like, I'm working on climate. Oh, that's so topical, climate change. No, climate. And when we today hear the word climate, it's climate change. And then we think of this. We think of scenarios, we think of graphs of rising temperatures, or rising levels of CO2, or different pathways. These are different pathways in climate scenarios of global warming. It's very understandable, but when we think of a future, it's normally it's relatively plain and clear what these graphs are talking about until you break them down to their mathematical or data set that they're based on, mathematical modeling or data set. When we think of climate change, we think of this: dystopia, CLIFE, you know, a burning planet. And this is how, in a certain kind of knee-jerk reflex, climate is normally connected to dystopic images of environmental disaster, mostly connected with heat scenarios. When you think a bit harder, you know that not everything will heat up on the planet. That Europe, if climate change really continues as it does, Europe will be much colder instead of warmer. So what we have when we think about climate change and a future marked by climate change is a relatively clear-cut, simplified scenario of how our lives will be affected by it. And normally, especially if you think of the longer future, this is in very dystopic images that do not really relate to our everyday experience of climate. Because when we think of climate as a definition, we think of the modern scientific definitions of climate, which is, this is the quotation that you have on the right side here. Climate, in a narrow sense, is usually defined as the average weather, or more rigorously, as the statistical descriptions in terms of the mean and variability of relevant quantities over a period of time ranging from months to thousands or millions of years. The classical period is 30 years as defined by the World Meteorological Organization. And this goes on to talk about the climate system, which is essentially the Earth system. What this does is on the one hand, give us an accurate definition of the basis of climate research today, which is very much data-driven. This is the other aspect is the chemical breakdown of air as a gas, but both air and climate in this definition are defined as something that is very much outside the realm of our experiences, of our perception, of our everyday life, and so on, no matter how hard we try to connect each warm day to climate change. But it's something out there. It does not touch us. It does not relate to us. This is, how do I say, connected to an everyday understanding of weather, climate, the air as something that is, again, a state of nature that we have to kind of keep at bay, or that we have to deal with, but that does not really affect us. There is this German proverb, es gibt kein schlechtes Wetter, nur falsche Kleidung. There's no bad weather, just wrong gear. There is the idea since early modernism that the early modern time, that the air is a weird substance somewhere between. Next to nothing is an expression by Robert Hooke, and that the air is something in between matter and immaterial. The air is unique among the elements in having this affinity with nothingness, in signifying the being of non-being, the matter of the immaterial. There has been a certain amount of criticism against this understanding of climate as a set of data, as weather, as an outside condition, and as the air as the matter of the immaterial, by a number of philosophers, and I will not go too deep into that. It would be Luce Irigaray in her comment on Martin Heidegger, the forgetting of l'oubli de l'air. It is David Abram in The Spell of the Sensuous, one of the, if you are like me engaged in ecological theory, you probably know him as an ecological thinker that who thinks very deeply about perception and the question of in what cultural frameworks allow what kind of perception of nature. And he points to the fact that with what he calls the Judeo-Christian tradition, but in fact it's rather Christianity, and the early modern scientific revolution, an understanding of air that was both breath, life, God, wind. I just list a few of these terms: ruach, tade, pneuma, nirchi, prana, as terms that tightly connect life, the divine, breath, wind. So in a word that in a certain way designates air. So the air is seen as something both very perceptible as a medium of communication, and a medium of communication between the earthly or living beings and the divine. Just one phrase by Abram: in the oral animistic world of pre-Christian and peasant Europe, as well as in indigenous cultures and some traditions of Asia, all things, animals, forests, rivers, and caves, had the power of expressive speech, and the primary medium of this collective discourse was the air. So what I would like to propose, in fact, is seeing or looking at air as such a medium, but not so much through the lens of indigenous cosmologies or non-Western tradition, but in fact looking through Western tradition, because as Karen said, I'm a professor of German, so I'm kind of in the middle of European tradition, and looking at a thought about air and climate that was precisely looking at air as a medium. This is one of the critics of this externalization of air and medium, the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who was very important for my whole theoretical framework. He in one of his articles, he makes these little drawings. This is position A, is placing humans outside the earth, on top of it, as ex-habitant, as he calls it. And this position B would be an understanding of being in the world as being to mingling with the world. This is what he calls the weather world. To feel the wind is not to make external tactile contact with our surroundings, but to mingle with them. In this mingling, as we live and breathe, the wind, light, and moisture of the sky bind the substances of the earth in the continual forging of a way through the tangle of lifelines that comprise the land and its life forms, including human life forms. This is very recent. It's a text from 2015. It's very typical of Ingold's approach to describing humans not as beings who are outside and separated of their object of perception, but who are entangled in a world of flows and energies and life forms in which they are part of, like everything else, and in which perception is rather a form of communication. So looking at this tradition, I was wondering, what does it mean to mingle with? It means in Ingold's case, being affected or being immersed in the object of perception. And so the question is, what is Aesthesis? In my title, you have maybe asked yourself this. Aesthesis means the wholeness of perception with all senses, smell, vision, aesthesia. I don't know. I found it's Gehörsinn. Well, how would you translate that? Hearing. Yeah, maybe. I found this in the dictionary. Anyhow, sense of touch, temperature, all the senses that you have as being, as participating in this immersion into the object of perception, which in this case would be the atmospheric surroundings. It also includes, and that might not be as obvious, the stories, images, theories that frame this perception or that afford this perception of being in the air. Thus, it relates very much to aesthetic in a more traditional sense, to aesthetic objects such as text, images, installations, as you just saw. So this is my approach to this being in the air, which implies seeing air not so much as a matter or as an object, as a mixture of gases, but as a medium, the condition of life of movement, of perception, etc. And this is, in fact, a very old tradition, and I will get into that tradition. That also means to ask not so much, as modern science does, what is climate, but what does it do? How does it affect us? What are its affordances? What does the air allow us to do, enable us to do? For instance, communication, hearing, music, breathing, and so on. The unforgetting of the air, as like in Abram or Irigaray, they really wrote a number of texts saying the forgetting of the air. And the question is, of course, how can we take back that or overcome that latency of the air and make it into something that we relate to in a very direct and sensuous way. That would be what I understand as an Aesthesis of climate, the perception of the atmospheres or the atmosphere and atmospheres. I will get back to that question of being one planetary atmosphere and many local atmospheres. Its or their sensuous and affective qualities and effects, the cultural meanings, narratives and images, etc. That's why, unlike what you may have expected, I'm not going to step into the future, but I'm going to take a trip back into history and ask what was climate before it became that which we can see in graphs, which we measure, which we compute in highly complex computer modelizations in order to predict the future or in order to even understand its mechanisms. That also means that we have to forget, in this case, differentiations that we would today make between, for instance, climate and weather or air and climate. That's not the same thing. I would refer to climate as a specific state of the air. The old notion of climate has many, many, many synonyms. Air and airs in the plural. You will hear throughout my talk, you will mostly hear me talk about airs in the plural, because this was the first term for what we would today call climate. Climate itself is a term that emerges in geography, in Greek geography, and firstly means the inclination of the sun, roughly to be translated as latitudes. But very often climate has synonyms that refer to entirely local terms such as topos, contrée, Himmelsstrich, Erdstrich, region. It rather rarely refers to weather, not in the old sense. I will show you the historical moment when all of a sudden climate becomes the average weather, but weather is rather something accidental to mostly what would be interesting is the rise of the sun, the regularly emerging winds, not one wind that we have now, but the wind that's always blowing from this and that angle, like the Scirocco, these qualities of the wind. Local atmospheres, but it can even the term can even allude to mood, Stimmung, to a certain state, psychical state that a given location puts you in. So this just a very brief glance at climates in the geographical sense as latitudes. They would be called not latitudes but paralleloi, but essentially the idea is that you measure the inclination of the sun and you get these latitudes. This is an expanded map of the Ptolemaic map, but it goes further north and south than the descriptions in Ptolemy. But this would be one classical understanding. This is climates, you know, and then you, I'm not going to go into it. There's a lot of nerdy stuff. Let me just move into other nerdy stuff here. Maybe the ancient, most important text on what then was that which we today would call climate. The environment of people, the landscape would be Hippocrates' text, airs, waters, places. In a certain way, this is the best synonym, airs, waters, places, with the emphasis on the plural of all three words, which is a bit weird. Air, waters, places is no problem. It's the idea that humans are profoundly shaped by these airs, waters, and places they live in. This is how the text begins. Whoever wishes to, it's a text, maybe that should be said, it's a text for a traveling doctor, who's of course not a doctor back then, but a traveling medical worker who comes into different cities and has to deal with different types of local states of health. And the whole point of this text is that you must understand the location in order to treat people. Whoever wishes to investigate medicine properly should proceed thus. In the first place, to consider the seasons of the year and what effects each of them produces. Then the winds, the hot and the cold, especially such as are common to all countries, and then such as are peculiar to each locality. We must also consider the qualities of the waters. In the same manner, we ought to consider the city's situation, how it lies as to the wind and as to the rising of the sun, for its influence is not the same whether it lies to the north or to the south, to the rising or to the setting sun. And so it goes. I will not, again, not go into this text deeply, but you get the idea. It's the local environment that shapes the bodies of people, shapes the state of health and the typical illnesses that they have, and it also shapes. This is in the second half of this treatise. It shapes the culture. It shapes the mentality. So it's very much an idea of the body as being marked or formed by its environment. However, the notion of environment is a bit misleading in this context because it's not something that environs the body, but the body, and the body is thought of as completely open to its surroundings, or these airs, waters, and places. I rather speak about the location of it's about the location. Being in this location, I am what I am, and my health is thus, and my culture is thus, and my bodily shape is thus. So the body is thought of as radically open to the influences of air, of temperature, of winds, of foods, of bodily practices, etc. But what's most interesting here is the one environmental, I say it again, influence that you cannot ever shield yourself, or that you cannot forego, that you cannot get out of, is the air. So this tradition, the Hippocratic tradition, which lasts until the end the end of the 19th century, has several, of course, transformations, keeps insisting that this is why air is the most important influence of a location on humans. As it connects humans to non-humans, men and animals breathe the exhalations of plants. This is a relatively late discovery in the 19th century, but what is very, very present is a different and more noxious function of the air, carrying miasmata, which means the exhalation of either processes of putrescence or decomposition, but also the exhalations of living beings. So it's death and life. Everything exudes some miasmata that travel through the air and then affect a whole community. So epidemics in Hippocrates are always explained as coming through the air because people can live differently, eat differently, etc., but they always breathe the same air. So sickness comes through winds, seasons, changing weather, miasmata, etc. Later in, not even later, it starts in antiquity as well. You have this idea that certain climates shape certain mentalities or characters, and that they're therefore more problematic climates and more temperate, balanced climates. There's a famous quotation of Aristotle that I did not include that speaks to that, and that humans are essentially. This is a from a letter of the 18th century. People feel like they're barometers. The state of the body indicates the states of the atmosphere, responds to it or resonates to it. Maybe those of you who have ever read some of Nietzsche's letters, he keeps complaining about the weather. He keeps traveling. I mean, it's not just complaining. It's not ridiculous. He feels profoundly sickened by certain states of climates. This is why he spends a lot of time then in Engadine and in the Mediterranean. Because he feels profoundly affected by certain climates and states of the weather. Air in the Hippocratic tradition, which again lasts much longer than we would think, is also seen as a social medium. In the cities, each inhabitant inhales what the others exhale. This is a quotation from Adalbert Stifter, Wiener Wetter. Our forefathers built the city so densely that it happens at times when I open my window in the morning to let in fresh air, that all I get is the night air from my neighbor's bedroom, who also has opened his window and wishes me a good morning. So you cannot escape all the exhalations. In a certain way, social life means constantly breathing in what others exhale. This is from the 18th century. On the one hand, François Boucher's image of Madame de Pompadour as the epitome of good smells, fragrances. On the other hand, caricature of farts. It's a kind of it's a map of the different qualities of farts. This shows the acres outside of. If you look, it's a very bad reproduction, but it shows the area outside of Paris where you have the what you do, the Schindanger, how would you call that? The carcasses of dead animals, you bring them there. You have dying, you have smelly industry there. So the 18th century has a very strong obsession with smells. Read Alain Corbin's, what's it in English? Le miasme et la jonquille. You will find it. You probably know it anyway. It's precisely about a heightened sense for the quality of the air in the 18th century. But this is not a specialty of the 18th century. In the 18th century, they really start to develop an enormous vocabulary for the states of the air. But essentially, the whole point would be, if you think of the body as being constantly affected or even attacked by the states of the air, you think of the air as something perceptible, not next to nothing, but as something very, very perceptible. There is an enormous trove of anthropological texts dealing with the effects of heat. There is, wait, I have this. Yeah, it's Montesquieu's infamous 14th book on the relation of climate and the laws. He has the idea that temperature, not anything else, but just temperature, puts the body in very different states of energy, but also of sensitivity. A cold air constringes the extremities of the external fibers of the body. Consequently, it increases their force. On the contrary, a warm air relaxes and lengthens the extremes of the fibers. Of course, it diminishes their force and elasticity. Sounds good. However, thinks of the body like a rubber band, which is, even by the standards of early 18th century, a totally reductionist idea of the effects of air on human bodies. There's a famous book by John Arbuthnot, the effects of essay on the effects of air on human bodies, that develops a relatively complex medical theory. This is from 1733. Now, the point with Montesquieu is not so much why does he write this very mechanistic theory of how temperature affects the body, and thus social relations, and thus people dwelling in the heat need different laws than people dwelling in the cold. But rather, why is he so reductionistic? Why is it so simplistic? He knows better. I have a theory about that, but this one was about a general culture of perceptibility. A last image I want to give you is from the 19th century. Our friend, of course, William Turner. You cannot give a talk on the air without showing one of his pictures. Now, anyhow, what you see is, of course, a type of atmosphere in which you cannot really differentiate anymore between human influences and like steam or smoke and fog or sunlight, clouds, and so on. What Turner tries to do is to paint what, I can only say this in German, we would call dicke Luft, thick air, an air that is a mixture of both social and industrial processes and natural processes. And he tries to paint that from being in this weather. There's a famous picture. It's not this one. It's a boat picture where he said, I had myself tied to the mast of this boat and I spent 6 hours in a snowstorm, like Odysseus tied to the mast, or it wasn't the mast, it tied on the boat outside in the weather. I did not paint it to be understood, but I wish to show what such a scene was like from the inside. I got the sailors to lash me to the mast to observe it. I was lashed out for 4 hours, and I did not expect to escape, but I felt bound to record as if I did. The whole point of Turner's painting is not to show, like Caspar David Friedrich, for instance, a perspective of clarity onto a landscape, and a transparent medium, but to show how the medium of the air in the age of industrialization thickens up and becomes intransparent, but to go inside this medium and show its thickness from, or its intransparency from inside. Okay, second point. This was the part of about the body, the air in the body, and the question of a culture of perceptibility of air that, to me, seems we have very much lost. A second aspect of this tradition is the tight link between climates and societies, or even climates and politics. This is called climate theory, and there's really a almost 2,000-year-long tradition of thinking about how does a given climate influence the ways of living in such a way that these different people living in different climates need different political systems. This is, wait, let me just jump to Montesquieu, because we already had that. This is what the conclusions that he has from his vivid description about how temperature changes the body. People are more vigorous in cold climates. Here, the temperature of the humerus is greater, the blood moves freer towards the heart, and reciprocally, the heart has more power. This superiority of strength must produce various effects. For instance, a greater boldness that is more courage, a greater sense of superiority that is less desire for revenge, a greater opinion of security that is more frankness, less suspicion, policy, and cunning. The whole point for him is to say it's from his theory of law or of political systems, is to say we cannot think about laws, since laws determine, or laws are rules that form the relation between people in a commonwealth. Now, these laws have to be also in a relation with the climatic or also geopolitical and many other conditions in which this commonwealth is located. So the whole idea is to bring something that we would understand as a purely social fact into a relationship with a given natural basis in which this society is located. Climate back in antiquity and up until the early decades of the 20th century is seen as explaining cultural differences. I will not go through this, even though it's very beautiful and fun. Climate this is not, he's not talking about air or climate here, but one of the consequences of saying people who are living in a location and form a commonwealth together, this climate shapes their habits, their bodies, as Montesquieu would say, their mentality, their everyday ways of life. That means that this shapes their identity. Aristotle describes this in great length and shows how the Greeks are different from what he calls the Asians and so on. But then he makes a point that I think is really interesting. He says, the members of a community must jointly possess a certain good of the same kind, something that they have, each and every one of them have a part in this same good, regardless of whether they have equal or different shares of it. This could be food, land of a certain size or something else of this kind. For example, my point would be to say, it's the climate. This is what they, no matter who they are, and where, you know, the only thing that matters is in fact where they are. They share this common air and this common state of the climate in which they have to adapt to what they have in a very Hippocratic sense, to the airs, waters, and places in which they live. Yes. One last aspect of this bond between climate and society would be climate and culture. This is a position from the late 18th century, Herder, the German theorist Herder, who describes climate as a general system that binds everything in nature to everything else. It's maybe one of the first very speculative and clearly not based on any natural sciences knowledge, but it's in a certain way a first formulation of the Earth as a system. As climate is a compound of powers and influences to which both plants and animals contribute, and which everything that has breath forms as an all-encompassing system, there is no question that man is placed in it to alter it by art. Okay, man is the species that can alter it by art, by his skills. Ever since he stole fire from heaven and rendered steel obedient to his hand, ever since he has made not only the beasts, but also his fellow men subservient to his will, he has contributed to the alteration of climate in various ways. Once Europe was a dank forest and other regions were the same. They are now exposed to the rays of the sun, and the inhabitants themselves have changed with the climate. Okay, there's two things he says. One is not so original. Climate shapes every place. This is the Hippocratic idea, in a different way. So there are singularities of places and environmental conditions, and they explain the singularities of cultures, differences between cultures. However, these cultures also, in their very specific way, shape their climates. They alter it. They cut the trees in Europe and made it arable land. They created systems of irrigation in the Nile Delta and in the Fertile Crescent, and so on. So the origin of culture is a way of negotiating your cultural ways with the ways of the climate. It's kind of a feedback process which, as climate shapes humans, they alter themselves through their changing of the local climate. Of course, this is not global climate change or anything. He's not a theorist of early theorists of climate change. That might be Buffon in some way, who really always talks about the whole planet. Herder is very interested in the differences between ways of life and cultures, etc. But he has this idea that it's a kind of feedback loop where one changes the other. Climate and culture change each other. So the tradition, wait, what's that? The tradition that links climate to society sees human society in a very close relation to their environment. Humans are different among each other because they live in different environments. They correspond in a pre-modern idea of harmony. Each people corresponds to their landscape. Political and social institutions have to adapt to the needs of a society as a given location. This is the core idea of climate theory, which is for a very long time, from Aristotle to Montesquieu and well into the end of the 18th century, is the idea that every political theory that you develop has to be twisted and tweaked and adapted to the needs of a specifically local way of living. It's not one size fits all. You have that in Baudin, you have that in Montesquieu. It's a kind of relational idea of polity. It can, you will be thinking, can that not tip into something very jingoistic, like we are better because we have the better climate? Yes, it very often tips into that. And this is why we hate these types of arguments. Like, no, it's always the temperate climate who prevails, that prevails. But what I find interesting for our way of repositioning humans in relation to climate, not just seeing it as something external, is the relationality, that thinking about a relativity and relationality between human ways of living and natural ways. Yeah. The last point of this theory, which I take very much from this quotation of Aristotle, is taking air and climate as a common denominator, but also as a common good to every society, meaning something that has to be subject to fair use, to cultivation, to protection, etc. In the 18th century or in the 19th century, this kind of climate protection might consist in draining a swamp. Today, we would say, oh no, bad idea. But they had this miasmatic idea of that swamps are generally moist landscapes exude miasmata. But the idea is also that no one can just establish a type of industry that puts miasmata in the air. They have to be outside. This is the big reform project at the end of the 18th century, when all the what we would today call polluting industry, as well as the graveyards, get taken outside of the cities. Third point, climate and cosmos. Essentially, these are variations of what one calls theory of the four elements. Here you see the image from the mid-13th century of a human body stretched out in the four elements. What I find interesting about it is that the water, fire, and air, the red is the air because it's connected to blood, and we would paint probably blue or something, or gray, but the idea is that the elements are not just environments of the body, but they're inside the body. They color the limbs of this human figure, and they are represented inside the human body through the four humors. So each element has to be in a certain kind of balance with within the human body. This also it's essentially, these are really more image examples than objects I will really analyze. The whole point is that the four elements are both outside in the macrocosmos. The macrocosmos consists of the four elements as much as the human body. The human body represents a harmony or a disharmony, dyscrasia, a bad admixture of the four humors, but it also pertains, for instance, to the seasonal cycles, to the qualities of the, here you have the four seasons, and each season is dominated by one of the elements and carries the, how do you say that? The qualities of the elements with it. The last image in this respect is from the 17th century. What you see here is a representation of the globe by the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, who shows, in fact, the earth as being made out of the four elements. Here is the internal fire, the heat. This is the water that is both on top of the planet, but also inside the planet. This is the earth. This is the earth, and this is, or this whole external white band is the air. So the whole idea is to think of, in terms of this elemental setting, to think of the air as a system made out of elemental cycles that, of course, form the human ways of life, but also that constitute the whole planet. So to sum it up, what was this old idea of climate? Climate is both a sense of the whole, as you can see in this way to, representation of the globe, both a sense of individual locations and how they affect human bodies, but also as a sense of the whole, how everything hangs together through this medium of airs and elements. However, it's also a theory of diversity, in the sense of a diversity of bodies, minds, and cultures that are created in their differences by climates. It's an idea of a necessary, almost existentially necessary perception of the atmospheric environment, because it is so invasive to the body. Climate forming cultures, but cultures forming or shaping climate in turn, and it's kind of an interactive process. And of course, a cosmic order of time, place, humans, and the non-human. So you will think, okay, it sounds good, but this all ended at one point. It ends with the emergence of modern meteorology in the second half of the 19th century. So the definition I gave you at the beginning, climate as the average weather and the state of the global climate system, is a definition that first you find in this in the history of meteorology, very famous Handbuch der Klimatologie by Julius von Hann, an Austrian meteorologist or climatologist. By climate, we mean the totality of meteorological phenomena that characterize the average state of the atmosphere at any point on the Earth's surface. What we call weather is only one phase, a single act in the sequence of phenomena whose complete, more or less uniform sequence year after year forms the climate of a place. So defining climate as the average of a very perceptible phenomenon as the weather, but not in the way it can be perceived, but in its average measurement, withdraws climate totally from perception. You cannot perceive averages. This is another example of the what one could call the datafication of climate. It's one of the first isotherm maps designed by Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt is one of the first scientists who it's really hard to say, because he's, on the one hand, he's very deeply entrenched in the old notion of climate. And then he's also the guy who says we need to gather data. And through his global network of correspondences and by hijacking the data set of the Palatina, he starts creating, by our standards, tiny, but by the standards of the time, big sets of data that show that the latitudes are not climate. You see that the isotherms veer from the latitudes towards the north, the Gulf Stream. But the whole point is to say we define climate as temperatures, and we look at the average annual, in this case, annual temperatures on certain given sessions of data gathering. And this is how, for the first time, we can start to think of climate as something global based on a set of measurements. This is another aspect of the end of climate. It's what I call a culture of insulation. This is really just an example. Greenhouses. Of course, greenhouses are big in the 19th century. That might not be by chance, but the general idea is that it's not about looking at how climate influences a culture, but about building cultures or ways of living that render a society independent of the climate. A culture of insulation through greenhouses, through heating systems, through dreams of insulating a whole, this is Buckminster Fuller, a whole cities under some kind of dome, or the culture that we have today. This is a photo I took at one mall in Singapore. That was very new at the time. But the whole point is to think of culture not as something that is in a permanent negotiation with culture, but something that can only develop itself and gain a certain degree of freedom by getting independent of the influences of climate. What comes to mind in this context is Deepesh Chakrabarty's famous quotation that the mansion of modern freedoms stands on an ever-expanding base of fossil fuel fossil fuel use. The whole point would be to say the ways in which today we have become independent of the rhythms of climate in the seasons, for instance, the influences of certain temperatures, weathers, and so on, is in fact based on a specific type of energy, which is an energy that is always there, that is fossil energy, as opposed to the energy of the sun that creates, that might not shine, that is subject to seasonal cycles and so on. So that would be the idea that modernity is very much hinges on this trove of fossil energy in order to make humans independent of the influences of climate. So the end of climate is made out of, I've mentioned meteorology and this idea of independence or freedom as independence of the climate, the end of climate has also certain epistemic thresholds. One of which is, of course, medicine, the end of miasma theory, the end of what one could call meteorological medicine, thinking about why does the wind make me so sick? It must be the Scirocco, and so on. And the end of cultural theories of climate, ending in a separation of bodies and climates. So it's not the climate, it is germs. This is Robert Koch, Louis Pasteur, modern germ theory, putting an end to the idea that illnesses come through the air. It also empties the air of its dangers. You have to really prove that something like COVID-19 really comes flying through the air. In most cases, it's rather vectors such as mosquitoes or water or food, but it's not the air as such that is a medium of health or illness, but you have to show which exactly is the pathogen. So that separates the medium of air from pathogens, for instance. Sociology, modern sociology, creates a self-referential idea of society. Environment in a social sense is not the natural environment, but it's the social environment. The whole surge of milieu, the notion of milieu is not the natural environment. Milieu is the social environment, which then becomes, as you can see in Zola, for instance, a very deterministic idea. It's like whatever there is in terms of social environment will absolutely create your fate. A culture of insulation or thermal neutrality. This is the famous air conditioning. But I see air conditioning not as a very specific type of technology, but rather as a symbol of a type of architecture, a type of urban planning, a type of our idea of bodily comfort. That means everything has to be somewhat thermoneutral, attuned to a certain degree of moisture and temperature that we feel as when we do not feel anything. That is the idea of, getting rid of natural influences. The end of the season, of course, the end of seasonal cycles in consumption, in economy, in energy use, and so on. And thus, freedom, this goes back to Chakrabarty's quote, as the permanent availability of things. It's not like we have to wait until something has ripened or it's the season for this and that, but it's permanent availability of things, of points in time, or mobility in space. Now, why might it be interesting to return to an idea? You might have thought, this is all nice and fine, but it's got nothing to do with our culture today. My point is to say there are certain implications in this tradition of thinking through and perceiving the air that speak very much to our most recent ideas or to the conundrum, how we can relate to the so-called environment in a different way than just externalizing it and then wanting to protect it and, First of all, the idea of the body as an open body. There's this post-humanist term, transcorporeality, that has been used for it. I'd rather call it the open body or even the Hippocratic body. Secondly, the atmosphere as global commons. And thirdly, the return of the elemental. Let's rush you through these ideas briefly. thinking of the body as open to the media of life in which it dwelt means to abandon modern dichotomies or modern separation as between innate and acquired, the body and the environment, the living and the non-living or the anorganic, nature and society, or local and planetary. We have newer research in biology or medicine points to an understanding of this open body, for instance, in such notions as holobionts, the body as a huge system of symbiosis with other organisms. We're not alone. I'm millions of other organisms. You may think I'm Homo sapiens, but that's not all. So these notions we have, when we look at air pollution, we see bodies massively afflicted by the state of the air or airborne diseases such as COVID-19. There is a return of biometeorology, looking at, for instance, mental health in a seasonal way, or in a way that certain weather conditions afflict people physically and mentally. The second would be the air as common good. Of course, and this really does relate to climate change, we are having this immense problem of thinking through how we could politicize climate as an object of protection or climate policy. Bruno Latour has suggested to see such things as the land on which we live or the air which we breathe as territory. I have my problems with this notion of territory, but the whole point is to say we should see this as something that belongs to us. This is not nature out there. Have you noticed how different your feelings are depending on whether you are asked to defend nature, boring, or to defend your territory, and you are immediately mobilized? His point would be to say, as long as we see nature as this thing outside that we might protect or leave in peace, we can never really engage in the political problems. We need to police abuse of this. If we define it as a global common, or as a common, even to say air, water, the ground is something that belongs to everybody, then we can start negotiating the rules of use. You know, this is, I think this is in fact really a return of this Aristotelian idea of we need a common good. Yes, I'm almost done. And lastly, with Earth system sciences, the idea of a return of the elements. This is really very much a depiction of the elements: water, air, earth, and fire with the sun. That might sound far-fetched. In fact, this is what Earth system science said. Yeah, we see our modelization as understanding the planet as consisting of very simple, yet very complexly organized entities. So there is this return of an elemental thought in modern science. Maybe this is a summary. Maybe we'll just skip that and stop here, and I'll answer your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Such a great example for combining history of science, history of ideas, literary texts, philosophical texts, environmental humanities, just things people talk about around here quite a bit. So we have some little time for questions. Yes.
I'm curious what made
Oh, here's Mark.
I'm curious, I was a little late. If you talked about how you got interested in this topic, and did you know when you started where it was going to lead to this discovery of a kind of paradigm shifting?
These stories are never very interesting. Yes, I could tell you that, but I wonder if it's an interesting story. I think what really got me to work on climate and not climate change. In my book on catastrophes, of course, I work on dystopic imaginations of climate change, but then I thought, climate is maybe more interesting. Was the experience of extreme climates that I had never experienced before. Tropical climates most of all, and then more specifically the process of acclimatization. I hated, I mean, it made me sick to the stomach. Tropical climate when I arrived, and then now I totally enjoy it. And so I was thinking, about this notion of the open body and how we cling to, climate thermal neutral spaces, airports and cars and our climatized houses. And what would it mean to expose yourself to climate in a way that you just say, okay, this is how it is. What do I do with it? And what I discovered are forms of low energy climatic intelligence. Like, okay, if you're in the tropics, don't eat lunch. Or if you do that much, move very slowly, wear a hat, don't try to run, it's just like, you can't do that. Same thing with I've seen blizzards in New York, and I really thought I'd die. I didn't, obviously, but I guess there are also rules to behave in this specific climate. So what I'm interested in, and there are a few examples in my book, are what I call forms of climatic intelligence that try to live with the climate and not go against it or try to shelter yourself against it, or I insulate, but what would it mean to cool a house just by the use of certain airflows and water sources and materials? I've seen that in Asia. Of course, it doesn't cool the house by 15 degrees, but this kind of very bodily experience of extreme climates, I guess, made me interested in, isn't climate more than just a question of measuring, computing, and then meeting each year at one inconsequential COP, But I'm not sure whether, this doesn't really translate into the book. What you see then as a cultural historian is a lot of rich material, and also aesthetically. I didn't use so much text, literary texts and images, but that convey this aesthetics, this icisness of the air, and have a very, very differentiated sensorium for the states of the atmosphere, or the local. It can be sounds, it can be smells, it can be certain winds. Maybe the best text on the topic is Thomas Mann's The Death and That you have in pandemonium atmospheric states.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your very rich talk, also rich in material. I have a question about research design, and that's really one that I ask myself too. At the end, you brought it back, right? You brought it back to the present. You brought it back to similar questions that we ask today, and maybe even similar sensibilities. And I always wonder, to what degree is this? It is generative, but what do we make with this? Right? There is a distinction, or there's a clear difference between an idea of the open body in the sense of a symbiosis or holobiont and Montaigne's theory of climate. So what do we take from this for now? Because I think it remained a little bit implicit in your conclusion, right? You say there are these similarities, but can we, I mean, surely we can't just look back and take over Montaigne's climate theory. So what is it that we do with this for these current concerns?
Yes, that's a very good question that I may not be able to answer it in a wholesale manner, but it would have to be answered regarding each specific aspect. For instance, the body and the air. If you look at today's medical approaches to weather or seasonal affective disorder and all that, you see that it still very much hinges on a relatively closed understanding of the body. So if you have seasonal affective disorder, it's not because you are in a state of resonance with your surrounding, but you have a lack of vitamin D, right? And then go see a shrink. So my conclusion in that specific chapter would be to say, why do not we take these resonances that other times had more seriously, also by reading these texts and poems and whatnot, and regaining an aesthesis, but also a vocabulary for description or for taking serious the fact that we are in some state of being affected by the state of nature. It also, I mean, in terms of material conclusions, it really would be a plea for a type of architecture and urban planning that aims at this, what I call low energy intelligence that works with airflows instead of air conditioning, and you can do a lot with just creating certain airflows. For instance, in the tropics, once I was in a indigenous hut, huge hut, in the middle of, it was outside, it was 100 degrees, inside was a fire burning. And it's like, these people are completely crazy. No, I went inside and it was on several stories, a very big thing with a kind of chimney in the middle, or a hole. And inside there was a constant flow of air, and it was much better than outside. And it also dried me a little. I don't know, it was super pleasant inside that hut with a fire burning. These types of things, and we still have architecture, urban planning, the way we build houses, that are totally about insulation, that are really about how can we create as much distance between the inside air and the outside air. There are many different ways to warm a body than just heating the air around it. So this is, I'm just answering regarding one specific strain of the book. The others, of course, are political ideas. It goes very much into this idea of global commons and of the question about how we can forego all these ideas of monetarizing climate. It's like if you pay, you can emit. And if you can afford to emit, or if we have no jurisdiction about your oil well, fine, we cannot do anything. If you think that, no, you're harming my property, you're harming everybody's property, or good, the common good, we have a different set of ethical and political rules we can use. But I understand it's a long shot. The reason why this long shot is so pleasant is the material is really so brilliant. So the shot gets ever longer.
I would like to know if you thought a little bit in connection with German literature and other literatures in these topics, how has this cosmology of where climate fits with worldview, because a lot of this is cosmologies, right? From ancient to now, how does that really affect the way so much as literature is framed beyond the future visions, for instance, and the dystopias? Have you seen, can you trace evidence of these cosmologies and climate ideas in literature? I'd love to know more about that.
Well, I have, when I look deeper into literature that is mainly texts from the early 18th century on, and these are European texts. So these texts very much engage with the state of the scientific knowledge, which starts in the 17th century to, they experiment with air, they draw a system of the trade winds. And so there's a lot of knowledge emerging in the 17th century that then, for instance, by a writer such as Bartolt Heinrich Brooks, gets put into poetry. It might not be the most entertaining type of poetry, but Brooks is one of the first writers who really, it literally says, die Luft ist ein Mittel. And he doesn't mean a means, but he means a medium. So looking at everything he knows in 1727 on how air functions, it's needed to oxidize, it's involved in burning processes, it's a driver of global trade, and so on. It's the carrier of sounds and voices. He tries to compress all this knowledge in a poem about the air as medium. That would be one text. I will not walk you through all the texts that I use because you're going to fall into a coma. Read the book. But in general, what one can say is that literature is a fantastic means of both introducing theoretical insights or complicated scientific framings and displaying the minutiae of observations of bodily sensations, emotional states of affairs, and so on. So this is why I love to work with literature, not only because it's my job, but because it's such a multi-medium in a weird way. It can frame so many different aspects of a thing.
Here's a microphone.
Oh, thank you so much for that amazing talk. And I was very taken by your move from matter to a mode of being, thinking about air in terms of being. And I thought that what's really helpful is to kind of, in this kind of really approaching climate as a history of the concept, but also really thinking about it as a model of knowledge that debunks this dichotomous notion that pits the subject against the world, and also thinking about the particular role of aesthetics, which is very empowering so that we don't constantly think about climate as an object that needs to be contained and measured. I think there's a kind of parallel history of air that become objectified and measurable in modern time. What I find interesting is the kind of interesting tension that you teased out between climate as a kind of demarcatable, thinking about Montesquieu or Comte, thinking about climate in relation to locale, to culture, right? So in that sense, the climate is not universal, but it's quite specific, tied to particular cultural practices. And the other side is what you are teasing out is really to think about climate as a global commons. And that tension reminds me of two notions of cosmopolitics, right? One is the Kantian notion of cosmopolitics, which is precisely thinking about the world in terms of the global commons. There's a kind of shared ethical moral law. The other notion of cosmopolitics is what Bruno Tao and Bruno Latour, not Bruno, Bruno Latour and Isabel Stengers thinking about cosmopolitics. That is, you cannot think about this common, global common. I think that goes beyond global because it's really thinking about cosmos. That common cannot be taken for granted. It's not human oriented. And how do you think about the commons across different species? So I feel like there's an interesting tension in thinking about climate as more local and specific, and the climate as cosmic. So I just wonder if you want to say more about that.
Yeah, that's a very complicated question, and I don't think I can give a satisfactory answer. The whole point is, in any event of foregoing the universalism of the likes of Kant or also Hobbes, thinking of a universal good that that applies to all humans equally. The whole point about looking at the Earth system is also looking at very specific needs and very differentiated types of interest or types of goods that need to be protected. So universalism, or even, I mean, you know that Latour loathes the notion of the global. He would always speak of the planetary, and the planetary is in itself, on the one hand, it's a thing, it's something in itself, but he wouldn't call it a whole. It's highly differentiated, and it's precisely planetary in the interplay of extremely different locations. You know, so in a certain way, he's back to Latour very much. Is back to Hippocrates, or you know, his notion of the critical zone is, yes, this zone is all over. It's the zone that you can trace on the whole planet as the zone in which life happens, which is essentially the troposphere. But then it's totally different wherever you look at it. You know, the climate is always something very local. So what I like is that formula of Ursula Heise's book of, I don't know, 15 years ago, Sense of Place and Sense of Planet. A sense of planet implies a sense of place, and a sense of a place implies always that you are here in that very singular way within the system of what Lovelock would call Gaia.
Thank you, Eva, for just such a exciting, thorough, you know, rich talk with so many wonderful things to look at and talk about. And thank you so much for your wonderful visit to us. Thanks again to Max Kade Foundation and to the Townsend Center. And very well, thanks.
Thank you.